Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another webinar at the National Library of Scotland. My name is Kenny Redpath, and I'm the Events Officer at the Library. Today, I am delighted to be introducing Andrew Dempster, who's here to talk about his new book, The Munros, A History. Andrew is a retired maths teacher and also has over 40 years' experience of climbing Scotland's mountains. He is nearing completion of a third round of the Munros and has climbed all the Corbetts and Grahams and has written the first guidebook to the latter. In addition, he has compiled a list of Hughes, Scottish hills below 2,000 feet, and has published the first volume of a guide to these summits. He has also walked and climbed in such varied locations as the Alps, the Pyrenees, the Himalayas, Africa, Iceland, Greenland, and the USA. I am just totally exhausted just reading this all out. But before handing over to Andrew, can I just say that there will be time for questions at the end of the webinar. So get thinking and just type your questions into the Q&A function, and we will do our best to get through as many as we can. But for now, over to you, Andrew.
Well, thank you very much. That was a great introduction. I should just say that this is the first Zoom meeting that I've ever done. In fact, it's the first time I've ever used Zoom. So I just hope and pray that there are no glitches, and I'm hoping that I wouldn't have to sort out any problems if they do arise. Now, in common with many others, my first Munro was Ben Lomond, which was climbed 43 years ago, way back in 1978. And almost exactly 10 years after I finished the first round of the Munros, completing on Ben More on Mull, the only island of Munro outside Skye, and again, a very popular one to finish on. And in doing so, I became the 594th Munroist, a Munroist being someone who has completed all the Munros. And then, like many other Munroists, on completion, I embarked on a postgraduate course of climbing the Corbetts. And for the uninitiated, the Corbetts are the next class of hill below Munros. They're hills between 2,500 feet and 3,000 feet. And as I was getting into them, about halfway through finishing the Corbetts, I completely changed to another class of hill. My allegiance shifted to the Grahams, and the Grahams are hills between 2,000 and 2,500 feet. So they're the next stage, the next class of hill below Corbetts. And some of you probably wondering, well, why the change to Grahams? Well, at that point in my life, it was the mid-1990s, I had already written 2 books, and I was actively seeking inspiration for a third book. And at that time, the Grahams were a reasonably well-established list of hills, but there was no guidebook. So I was determined to fill the gap in the market and write a guidebook to the Grahams. And the result was my third book, The Grahams, A Guide to Scotland's 2,000-Foot Peaks, which was published by Mainstream in 1997. Now, the previous 2 books I'd written, only one of them was a guidebook. That was the first one, the book on scrambling, which was called Classic Mountain Scrambles in Scotland. And scrambling is the kind of the middle ground between hill walking and rock climbing. And at that time, there was no guide to scrambles for the whole of Scotland. There were local guides, but there was no universal guide, if you like, for the whole of Scotland. So that was another gap in the market which I had identified. Now, the second book, this is called The Munro Phenomenon. This is the one which has special relevance to the talk today, because that really was an attempt to explore the history of Munro bagging and its compulsions and philosophy. It wasn't just another guidebook. And the book was essentially a forerunner to the book that I'll be discussing. The Munro Phenomenon was published in 1995, and as well as being out of print, it's now hopelessly out of date. So whether it was the enforced lethargy of lockdown or the discovery of several new developments in Munro-related matters, or the murmurings of certain people that the Munro phenomenon was due a complete overhaul, or a combination of all three, I began writing the Munro's history in October of last year. And in my own experience, from starting a book, putting pen to paper and to publication in less than a year is something of a record, especially since it was originally handwritten and then typed into an iPad with one finger and predictive text. Now, some would argue that history can't change, so why write another book? Well, apart from the fact that only around 1,000 people had climbed all the Munros in 1995, and today the total is nearly 7,000, the intervening years have seen the creation of, for instance, the Munro Society in 2002, the Land Reform Act came into being in 2003, then there was the 100th anniversary of Hugh Munro's death in 2019, and then there was an incredible run by somebody called Donny Campbell, who we'll be mentioning later, who ran around all the Munros in under 32 days in 2020. But what really clinched things was the discovery of a man who came to prominence recently through the action of his great-great-grandson, Hamish Johnston. And he wrote a book called Matthew Forster Heddle, Mineralogist and Mountaineer, which was published by the National Museums in Scotland in 2015. Now, it turned out that Heddle was a key player in the eventual creation of Munro's tables. Although he was a mineralogist by profession and he was a trained doctor, his first love was the Scottish mountains, and his knowledge of them was unsurpassed. He was about almost 30 years older than Munro, so he was like a kind of father figure to him, an old man of the mountains, if you like. In fact, he was held in such high esteem by Hugh Munro that he made him an honorary member of the Scottish Mountaineering Club in 1893. When he was 65, and this was unfortunately only four years before his death. Munro and Heddle had actually met for the first time 10 years earlier on a box seat of the mail coach from King Eusey to Fort William, where Heddle would attend the opening of the Ben Nevis Observatory the following day. And so impressed by Heddle was Munro that he later remarked, "What an agreeable travelling companion he was, what a fund of information, and how pleasantly he told it." Now, when Munro's tables were first published in 1891, several people were actively pursuing the 3,000-foot peaks, namely Heddle, obviously Munro himself, somebody called Colin Phillip, Joseph Stott, Peyton. So there were various people, but Heddle by far was ahead of the rest. He had climbed something like 350 tops in Scotland. And in comparison, Munro had only done 27 tops on joining the SMC in 1889. Heddle worked from his own list of 409 peaks. Now, unfortunately, this list has never been found, which is a great shame because so much could have been learned from it. And it's probably true to say that Munro had possibly seen this list, and he certainly had gleaned much information from Heddle. Unfortunately, by the early 1890s, Heddle was plagued by ill health, and had this not been the case, he could easily have been the first Munroist. When Heddle died in 1897, Munro paid tribute to him by saying, "There can be little doubt that Professor Heddle had climbed far more Scottish mountains than any man who has yet lived. Wherever he went, there was not only the trained geologist, but the truest lover and keenest observer of nature, and above all, the Scottish mountains. It is indeed a privilege to have known Professor Heddle." And I would just add amen to that. Now, the majority of hill walkers in the 1890s enjoyed long forays into the hills over several days, unrestricted by the motor car. and of course this included Heddle and Munro. Some say this was the golden age of mountaineering and exploring in Scotland before large-scale Sitka spruce plantations, hydro schemes, wind farms, which generally changed the face of the Highlands. Also at this period, the glens were still populated with keepers and shepherds, and a night's accommodation was easily forthcoming. Of course, today the trend is more towards day trips, with the obvious advantage of having a car, but there are some exceptions, and one particular example comes to mind: multi-Munroist Hazel Strachan, who has now completed 10 rounds of the Munros, revels in long solo sojourns into the mountains, and of course many other individuals enjoy multi-day trips, bothying or camping. Now, in addition to Matthew Heddle, there is another major figure in the early history of Munro bagging who was only briefly mentioned in the Munro phenomenon, but is covered in detail in the new book. This man is the second Munroist, the Reverend Ronald Byrne, who, like the first Munroist, A.E. Robertson, was a man of the cloth, and not only the second Munroist, but the first to complete all the hills on Munro's list. That is, including the subsidiary summits known as tops. Most of the information on Byrne was gleaned from Elizabeth Allen's excellent book, Byrne on the Hill, published in 1995, just after the Munro phenomenon came out, in fact. Now, Byrne was a rather reserved and socially awkward individual, described by Elizabeth as a short-legged hunchback and a social misfit, which certainly doesn't pull any punches. However, Byrne did have a natural flair for long-distance tramping and could move incredibly fast, sometimes as fast as 6 miles per hour. I struggle to cycle at that speed. Stamina, speed, and a steely determination were his mainstays, but he was woefully inadequate in other particular skills of hill walking. For instance, navigation, risk assessment, and nutrition. And in some ways, because of his weaknesses, he was more of an identifiable character than, say, Robertson. He had lower social standing and he had these human weaknesses, whereas Robertson was from the upper echelons of society. Now, like those of his time, almost all of Byrne's trips were extended forays into the hills, staying at keepers' cottages, where he was often a big hit with the women, who were glad to have an outsider to talk to. Then, moving on from the early history, the second half of the book is devoted more to recent trends and developments, such as the exponential rise in Munro bagging from the late 1970s through to the 1990s, and then on to the more leisurely linear increase today of around 200 new Munroists per year. In the book, in chapter 5, which is called Boomers and Baggers, I have argued that the exponential rise was due to the baby boomer generation taking up hill walking. And I made the comment that the drug-induced euphoria of the Woodstock era was giving into a new and healthier hill-induced euphoria, where addiction reached new heights, metaphorically and literally. Take from that what you will. Now, in the 1970s and 1980s, many books began to appear relating to Munros, but one in particular had a huge influence on the uptake of Munro bagging. Hamish's Mountain Walk by iconic hill gangrel Hamish Brown. Hamish needs no introduction to dyed-in-the-wool aging hill walkers like myself. He was the first person to complete a continuous round of the Munros in 1974. And for many years, he was the completer of most Munro rounds. Then in 1985 came the first guidebook to the Munros, the SMC guide, which has undergone many editions and now morphed into the latest 2021 edition. And I've said that this is a beautifully produced heavyweight tome and a veritable feast for Munro lovers. Exactly 100 years after the launch of Munro's Tables, the first TV series devoted entirely to Munro's was aired. Now, whether this was intentional or coincidence, the fact that it was exactly 100 years after Munro's tables were published, I don't know. But what is known is it was a crucial spur for couch potatoes, and especially women who could now bag Munros without a bearded male companion. The Irish comedian Ed Byrne was an 18-year-old student at my old university, Strathclyde in Glasgow, when he first saw the programme, and he has now over 100 Munros under his belt. Chapter 6 of the book is devoted to the many non-stop Munro rounds, which obviously started with Hamish Brown's round in 1974, and records as well. And this, of course, culminated in Donny Campbell's astounding 32-day record set in 2020. In the Munro phenomenon, I said that the Munros in a month could be said to have ultimate challenge status. And Hamish Brown had commented in the foreword to the book that when someone does the Munros in a month, I will shake my head and his hand. And the fact that Donny almost did this, came within a hair's breadth of doing it under 32 days, is an incredible achievement. And just to give an example, on his second last day, he climbed 18 very remote Munros, starting with Sleach, moving on to the 5 in the Fisherfield Forest, then Anchellach, then all of the 9 Fannichs, and then he cycled up to Ben Wyvis and climbed that, and then he slept for 30 minutes, and then went on and did the other 10 Munros north of that. I'm speechless just to read that. Now, in the last few chapters of the book, I move away from the historical and non-stop epic rounds to the philosophical, whimsical, and humorous side of the pursuit, and attempt to answer the question, why climb Munros at all? And there are some obvious reasons: freedom, escape, peace, solitude, challenge, and above all, fun. And these are just some of the reasons we climb hills. Perhaps the humorous aspect is best summed up in the first of 2 short Munro monologues, which appear at the end of chapter 7, chapter 7 called the Why, the Wry, and the Whimsical. And what I'm going to do is read through this first Munro monologue and see what time we have. There's two monologues. One of them is a true story, one of them is false, and I'll leave the listener to decide, if we read both of them, to decide which is which. So the first story is about a certain Hugh Munro of Furness, and apologies to all those who have seen the film Local Hero. This is actually an unedited version, although not much changes between this version and the one in the book. So, story 1. Hugh Munro of Furness was not your average God-fearing, Calvinistic, Sabbath-respecting, wee-free church minister. The fact that he had been climbing Munros for years in order to raise money for a complete refurbishment of the local pub kind of said it all, especially considering the church was in dire need of attention. His local hero label by his loyal parishioners was certainly not shared by his formidable wife, Morag, a stereotype of the mad battle axe variety, who regarded Munro bagging like dancing or drinking as the devil's pastime. Wee Hugh's and mighty Morag's manse was the only house where the words rolling pin and ouch could be used in the same sentence. Hugh was a great fan of Robert Burns, and especially the poem Tam O'Shanter, so much so that he rewrote the first verse as a special ode to both his Munros and his wife, Morag. When Munro machos leave the street, and couthie baggers meet, as mountain days are wearing late, and suffering spouses wait, irate, while we sit dreaming at the cairn of no hain a wifey and a bairn, we think now on the long Scots miles, the tops and peat hags, bogs and stiles, that lie between us and our hame, where sits our sulky, sullen dame, gathering her brows like gathering storm, nursing her wrath to keep it warm. Wee Hughie, as his parishioners called him, was well aware that he was the namesake of the big man himself, Sir Hugh Munro. Although he was sure that out of all the thousands of completers, there must be another Hugh Munro, and that actually there is another Hugh Munro, but we'll come back to that. His real motivation for bagging Munros was the fact that the first two completers were both clergymen. If a Church of Scotland minister and an Anglican minister could climb all the Munros, then he could be the first wee free minister. Following his recent hip operation, wee Hughie felt as fit as a fiddle, and his experience and knowledge of Munros was well known. Despite being a baby boomer, the 60s revolution seemed to have passed him by, and although he couldn't tell funk from punk or garage from grunge, he knew the difference between the top of a Munro and a top of the Munro. The only Rolling Stones in dire straits he had heard of was when he lay floundering at the bottom of the Great Stone Chute in the Coolin. Wee Hughie was a paid-up member of the hip-hop generation, as opposed to the hip-hop generation. It was one day, sitting dreaming at the cairn of Buccleuch Moor in Glencoe, when he began chatting with a stranger and endeavouring to put names to the various peaks around them. There was one specific pointy summit on the horizon, which neither of them could initially name. Now, according to Muriel Gray in her book, The First 50, if folk are arguing about what that pointy peak on the horizon is, the answer is always Schiehallion. No matter what Munro you happen to be on, remember that the pointy peak in the far distance is always Schiehallion. This saves a lot of time. In fact, a third walker to arrive at the cairn heard the two of them discussing this and immediately divulged his superior knowledge and informed them, with a barely concealed arrogance, that the hill in question was indeed Schiehallion. To wee Hughie, this newfound knowledge had a profound effect on him. Already nearing completion, he had for some time wondered which Munro would be suitable for his last. For Hughie, it had to be one with striking individuality and having a good path most of the way up. Schiehallion fitted the bill perfectly, and his mind was made up there and then. Fast forward 6 months to Furness Village Hall, where parishioners were busy preparing for a grand ceilidh and raffle to celebrate wee Hughie's Munro completion and raise more money for the pub refurbishment. Hughie himself was up a stepladder, lost in concentration, as he carefully painted large black letters on a large poster proclaiming Hugh Munro's last Munro, Schiehallion. Beside him on the ladder and next to his paint tin was a bottle of 25-year-old Lindertis, finest malt whisky, a special treat he had saved for a very special occasion. The old adage of one's just right, two's one too many, and three's not half enough wasn't lost on Hughie, especially the last bit, and he was already on his 4th dram. Not for reasons of enjoyment, however, but to calm his nerves following a tussle from the bickering, bull-headed Morag, who couldn't really grasp or believe that he had climbed all his ridiculous mountains, as she called them. Whilst engaged in a section of particularly awkward lettering, Hughie felt the distinct presence of someone looking up at him from below. Indeed, there was someone there, the notorious village interfering busybody known as Sandy the Snoop, or Snoopy for short. Suddenly Snoopy blurted out, "Are you sure there's 2 L's in Schiehallion?" Hughie, concealing his anger and disgust for a few seconds, turned round to look disdainfully down at Snoopy and replied, "Aye, another 2 G's and bugger off." Unsurprisingly, Snoopy did bugger off, tail firmly between legs. Several minutes later, Hughie heard the unmistakable foghorn tones of mighty Morag, and in blind panic, grabbed the whisky bottle and sloshed it into his large paint tin, while simultaneously gulping back the remains of his glass with his other hand before stuffing it into a pocket. Seconds later, Morag appeared below the ladder to cast a disparaging stare at Hughie and his masterpiece of calligraphy. She then spoke in an accusing tone. "I dinna believe you've been up that Schiehallion or whatever you call it. You've probably been in that bloody pub all day." Hughie, controlling his annoyance, turned round and replied coolly, "I've told you before, Morag, as a wee free minister, I never drink whiskey, I never swear, and I never tell lies. As he turned back triumphantly to resume his task, his elbow hit the paint tin, sending it crashing to the floor, complete with Landertis 25-year-old, which Julie smashed, the precious contents mixing with black paint and oozing out across the floor of the hall. The hubbub of the hall was suddenly reduced to deadly silence, and a dozen faces turned to Hughie and his ladder. There was no record of Hughie's graphic exclamation, but it was safe to say that it was safe to assume his second vow of I never swear was well and truly broken. Now, I think there's probably time to read the other story. I think it's just coming up to 2:30, so the other one is not as long. So you can decide when you've heard the two stories which one's the true and which one's not. So the second monologue. Sir Hugh Munro sat pensively in the armchair, staring blankly into the middle distance, possibly contemplating his last 3 tops. He cut a dash in his hunting Fraser tartan kilt, a vast improvement on the official Munro clan tartan of garish red and yellow. Looking more closely, however, revealed something wasn't quite right. No, it wasn't his Glengarry bonnet or smart tweed waistcoat and jacket, nor even his sporran or woolen socks. It was his walking boots that drew the eye, oddly modern looking with not a hint of hobnails or trichunis. Yet there was still something else strangely unreal about this ghost, this robotic reincarnation of a long deceased knight. Was this some kind of spooky apparition of Hugh Munro from beyond the grave? If you had attempted to engage in conversation with him, you would not even have received a glimmer of recognition or indeed consciousness. This being could not be considered to be even remotely alive. This being was no sentient entity, but a sedentary effigy, the grotesque Frankenstein-like creation of none other than great Robin of Clan Campbell. Robin was about to right a great wrong of Munro bagging history and redeem Sir Hugh Munro's rightful place as a complete Munroist by escorting him up his final 3 summits. No matter that he was a curious concoction of clay, latex, tubular bandages, coat hangers and pillows, the ghostly essence of the great man himself was assured. Even a visit by Robin to his grave at Landertis did not result in any portentous omen, which could have signalled the knight's disapproval of this harebrained but honourable scheme. And so it came to pass that on the 10th day of November in the year 1991, great Robin and his trusty companion, the doctor, Helen Ross, together with a subdued Hugh Munro, battled through Glentilt in miserable weather to eventually reach Tarf Bothy. The good doctor wisely decided to keep her powder dry and remain in the relative comfort and shelter of the Bothy, while Batman and Robin continued on their glorious quest to reach the summit of Carnan Fiddler. The weather was considerably worse than that of the 11th of July 1908, when the living Hugh Munro had made his failed attempt on this elusive summit. Rain had turned to snow, and arrival at the summit cairn was accompanied by howling wind and whirling icy spindrift. Even the knight refused to leave his cloistered protective cocoon of plastic bin bags, and a hasty return to the Bothy reunited the fearless trio before the final leg in torrential rain and increasing darkness returned the gallant heroes to safety. The following Sunday, history was made when Robin and the knight successfully reached the summit of Carncloch Vulan in more agreeable weather. This was, of course, Sir Hugh's intended last Munro, now demoted to a top, and his revenant was able to finally emerge from his womb and pose for an historic summit photograph. Instead of Landertis' 25-year-old malt, Munro's posthumous completion was celebrated with a sorry substitute of lukewarm coffee. Less than a week later, the brave knight was smuggled into the Roxburgh Hotel in Edinburgh, where he would become the focal point and the highlight of a very special evening. A multitude of 223 people, of whom 155 were complete Munros, had gathered to celebrate the centenary of the publication of Munro's Tables. Following Robin's speech, the man himself was unveiled for all to see and naturally received a rapturous reception. The postscript to this grand saga occurred the following year, when Robin, Sir Hugh, and another climber, James Kenyon, made the ascent of Sir Hugh's last top, the inaccessible pinnacle of Sgurgerag, now, of course, a Munro. Finally, all 538 tops on his original list had been climbed, and now the great knight could finally rest in peace. Still no Lindertis though, but a bottle of champagne was a huge improvement on lukewarm coffee. This ended the first and only case of Munrosus posthumus. And that completes my talk. Thank you.